All right, welcome to the first online lecture of Sports Media 101. This lecture is called Sports Journalism. The typical in-class lecture would run about 40 minutes, but I'm hoping with all of these to kind of break down into two or three sort of subtopics and hit them a little bit quicker than I would in a typical in-person lecture. Nobody wants to sit through a 40-minute video online of some professor droning on. I'm hoping to make these a little bit quicker so they're a little bit more palatable. So that brings us to our sort of subtopics within this lecture, and this will be presented as three separate videos. So this first video is going to focus specifically on multi-platform sports journalism, ways to conceptualize it, ways to think about it, but we won't in this video get into Associated Press style, and we won't get into the sports story or the common sports stories that are used in our current sports media. Again, breaking it out, trying to do maybe 5 or 10 minutes on each of these videos, make them a little bit more palatable. And so let's get right into it. So this first sort of sub-lecture is multi-platform sports journalism. And what we're talking about really here is sort of a reconceptualization of what it means to be a sports journalist. In the traditional sense, when someone wanted to go into sports journalism, they would first just start off with the world of journalism and print journalism at that. So most of the time, a sports journalist was a reporter for a newspaper covering sports, or perhaps just a sort of a general assignment reporter that eventually got shifted over to sports once sports became sort of a popular enough element of the newspaper that it was drawing its own crowd, and sort of the editors of the newspaper, or on the radio or eventually TV side, the news directors saw enough of an asset in sports that they would dedicate full-fledged assignments to or departments to sports so they knew there was a sort of a regular audience there for it. Again, looking at a multi-platform sports journalist is really looking at sort of a reconceptualization of that original concept of a print journalist who focused on sports. So here we're bringing in all of the sort of the modern platforms that we're thinking about today. So no longer is a reporter for the Indianapolis Star that covers sports, a sports reporter for the Star. No longer are they just submitting columns or just submitting print stories to the hard copy newspaper. It's well beyond that, where they have certainly the online edition is a component of it that is sort of the immediate sort of adjustment as we moved into the internet age a couple decades ago. But there's also sort of the all the visuals that are required. There's a social media that's required. There's actually on-air performance. If you think about a print journalist in the past, certainly wouldn't have to do a lot of face in front of the camera kind of work. But as we see, especially amongst the more popular reporters and columnists, they're also asked to do sort of analysis pieces or reaction pieces that are on camera, either acting as the host or acting as sort of the expert being interviewed, as sort of or perhaps maybe a co-host type of situation. But it's moved again well beyond the print-only mindset that sports journalism used to be in. So you might ask yourself why the need for all these additions, and the sort of the short answer is that consumption is no longer linear. It's no longer waiting around for the newspaper to come out every morning or every evening, whatever it might be. It's moved well beyond that sort of linear consumption where we're waiting for newspapers, we're waiting for a 6 o'clock broadcast. We moved into a nonlinear era of consumption, and every media job just has to sort of accept that and reshape how they operate and how they conceptualize their content and package their content for their audience to meet this sort of nonlinear consumption. So that includes digital, sort of almost immediate access to game write-ups or preview pieces, whatever time might be sort of appropriate for a preview piece to come out. And that's shifted, again, how we conceptualize the audience, how we conceptualize their consumption, but also how we need to rework the production of news, the reporting, the asset collection. So if we're again moving this away from a print journalism as the sort of the standard and the only type of thing that you do as a sports journalist is print journalism, and sort of rethink that to thinking of yourself as a multi-platform. That changes the assets that you need to collect as a reporter in the field. So the easiest example is that you are reporting and delivering content to your audience as the event unfolds in most cases. So if you're asked to go cover a Pacers game or a Colts game or a Butler Bulldogs game, you are in the moment. Most likely going to be asked at some point if you're a beat reporter for those teams to be live tweeting or some other social media before, during, and immediately after the game. So sort of almost like live check-ins as the event is unfolding. And this would never have been the case a generation ago or somewhere around probably 10, 15 years ago, where you would have time after the game ended, collect your thoughts, sort of analyze what happened in the game, what led to victory, what led to defeat, and then post it or get it ready for the morning paper, perhaps if you go back long enough, or even if it's only sort of in that brief window of time where there was the internet but before social media, you'd still have time to sort of collect thoughts and post relatively quickly after the game, but still some time to sort of process through it. Now, the production of news content, the reporting is so immediately aligned with delivery that there's so little time for actual analysis or thought even. It's just, here's what's happening right now. No time to think about it. You just deliver it to the audience. So that drastically changes the production timeline of the sports journalists. And again, that most reporters have turned into mobile journalists, often sort of live tweeting or live coverage as stories unfold. And then beyond that, beyond sort of the live immediacy of it, we need to be thinking about these stories as content packages. So depending on the platform that you're sending it to, the assets that you need to collect might be greatly or just in a sort of minor way different. So if you're producing content for a visual social media, if you're producing content that's going to be later repackaged into some sort of video content as part of like a larger broadcast piece or a larger online video piece, if you're going to be producing content for a platform that's more maybe perhaps a podcast that's sort of audio driven, or still images if it's still image driven. All of these things, all these assets need to be collected, but it has to be done in a way that you know what your platforms are on the back end, so that way you are when you're out there as a reporter covering an event, you are collecting the appropriate assets to sort of repackage for each of those platforms that you might be going to. So you'd still conduct the sort of the same interviews that you might do for a print piece, but you also need to maybe get some raw sound of an interview or still images around the arena or video of the home team celebration after the win or whatever it might be. You need to be thinking about the audience and the consumption and the platforms well in advance of the story, so you can be more planful going into. Now, in terms of the actual writing of the piece and the delivery of content, there are a lot of things that have changed, but there are some things that haven't changed. So sort of the necessity for writing sort of good, crisp, clear headlines that are both enticing but straightforward, lead sentences, general story structures, especially when we're putting things on the web, or even when it makes it into the hard copy version, the standard story structures are still there. So those things haven't changed. All the sort of the quality writing and quality sort of delivery of a story. Now, what has changed, of course, is how those things get repackaged and linked together. Scrollovers, social, sort of driving users from social media back to your sort of home base of either your traditional outlet or certainly your outlet's web page. So driving users back. And then once they're there, there's all sorts of other options that get played out as well. So once they get back to your home base, maybe your home website, there's sidebar stories that are often sort of smaller features or personality profiles that are based on an original sort of event coverage type of story. So those sidebars happen all the time, and there's sort of links directly moving you out. You also link to archived stories that can sort of get the user going deeper, more clicks through your page. a number of photo, video, audio galleries or sort of supplementary types of materials. And in often is the case that the full print story has a related video package to it. So this could be a compilation of still images, video images of the event itself, or it might be raw video or just raw audio of some of the interviews that were conducted, maybe like full context interviews. So if an interview took a handful of minutes to conduct, but you might only take out a couple snippets for the story, you might say, for the full interview, click here, and you have this sort of supplemental material for your audience, again, to click in deeper to your outlet. But again, in all of this, the headlines and visuals, things that have sort of always been there for luring in customers or consumers. So if you're thinking about a hard copy newspaper, the headline and the above the fold visual are what typically draws people in the most. And then getting people to stay there hasn't really changed either. It's once they've clicked in and they say, yes, I want to engage with this, or it's enticed me enough to buy in, then we have our textual content. And it might not necessarily be text. It might be sort of the deeper content of your raw video, raw sound, your sit-down interview, or your print story, whatever the case might be. That storytelling is still there as the element that keeps consumers with your story and with your outlet. And so this proliferation of supplemental materials and other assets that add to the story has really challenged what have been sort of traditional limitations in the print world or the broadcast world of time and space. The internet obviously has unlimited space. Can make a story as long as you want it to be in theory. But there are other limitations for these sort of new media. So if you're working on a newspaper, your editor might say you can only do 500 words on a story, we'll say, or oftentimes it gets measured in page space, so number of inches a story can fill. Not necessarily the case with the internet, and the same with the video or audio side. So if you're doing a radio show, a sports content on a radio show, or sports recaps or previews or things like that, your editor or your manager would say you have 7 minutes to do this. Same thing on the broadcast TV side. You might have 1:20 for a package, 30 seconds for a voiceover. This story manager might say gets 45 seconds. Do with it what you will, but it's a really a time crunch on it. All of these limitations aren't necessarily so on the internet, but what we do have are audience-based limitation. So there's limitations on how much they will tolerate. So a story that is a video that's running on maybe 3, 4, or 5 minutes, there's almost no chance that your audience is going to sit there and watch a video that lasts 5 minutes. And I realize as I'm saying this video is at 13 minutes, so I'll pick up my pace. But especially for sports media content, they're not going to want to sort of sit through that, even though we have unlimited space and unlimited time. We have a limitation with how much our audience will demand. And the other element of it is that we have reporting resource limitations. So there's only so many things that we can get a picture of. There's only so many things that we can get audio for or video for. And those limitations, so what the audience will tolerate and how many things you can physically gather before the event becomes too sort of old and stale, those are the main limitations on this new age of multi-platform sports journalism. So because your time and resources are limited in the sort of the reporting side, the production side, we need to be really planful for what the audience is demanding on the back end. And typically this plays out in the concept of sort of embassies and home base. So embassies are often seen as sort of peripheral types of platforms that can lure in readers or viewers or consumers, but don't typically deliver the full content. So you might get sort of a snippet, some sort of preview tweet or some sort of commentary tweet, and then if you want the full story, you'll have to click through to get back to sort of the home base, the web outlet, or perhaps it might be some sort of preview tweet says check out for the full story, check out the newscast at 6 o'clock or the morning paper. Most of the times the home bases are being sort of transitioned to online outlets That's where we're trying to drive consumers rather than using our embassy as kind of a sales pitch of like, hey, check it out tomorrow morning on the morning show. That's typically not how it's playing out in sort of the current environment. One thing to note about sort of the embassy's home base, how we're telling our story and sort of snippets on these embassies. There's still that central focus. There's still a sort of central thread that runs through the story that is still the primary element, regardless of where our content's being packaged and being delivered. We still have that sort of that angle, that central focus of our story that's driving all of this content. So it doesn't become just a pure sales pitch where we're just trying to entice. There's still information being delivered in all of these platforms, at least in sort of the current state of sports media. There may be some organizations or some media outlets that are pressing the envelope a little bit and becoming far too much of sort of clickbait and not having any sort of actual content in all of their deliveries. It's more of just sort of enticing people. But the standard is still for it to be, we're giving information, we're giving what our audience wants, what our audience needs in some cases, in all of these elements. Okay, we're at our final slide. So again, the way I conceptualize this with embassies and home bases and nonlinear consumption for your audience and multi-platform, it's all about organization and collection of assets. So you know what your platforms are that you're shooting for before you actually go out and report and before you do your story. So then it's really a matter of organization and planning of like, okay, I know I need to put something together for the podcast that we're producing for this. So I know I need raw sound, I need natural sound, interviews, voiceover perhaps. So I'm gonna build that into my production schedule of sort of what I need to get done while I'm at the game. If you want to think about it in terms of a reporter. In most cases, you'll still have a written story element to it. So you have primary sources, secondary sources. You'll observe the game itself, of course, taking notes throughout. So there's that element of it. And then there might be some visual elements of it as well. So my editor tells me that I need at least 3 or 4 or 5 or a dozen photos taken. Maybe 3 or 4 could actually make the story. Or there might be a piece where we need to have raw sound of the post-game press conference, and we'll cut it up later as we need. But whatever it might be, whatever platforms your outlet, your end game is going to be, you need to have that plan going in, so that way you are maximizing your efficiency as a reporter out in the field covering these things. So again, it's a multi-platform. You're a multi-platform journalist, but you don't have the time or resources to get everything possible for every possible platform. So it's really a matter of planning and organization to sort of maximize your time at that event. And that's all we have for this lecture. I ran longer than I wanted to. Apologies for shooting nearly 18 minutes. All right, that's the end of this one.